The first two-thirds of verse 10. So we're to this last phrase, then shall he return and be stirred up even to his fortress. The problem with the end of the verse is the subject. From all appearances, we're talking about a couple of attacks. We're talking about some type of renewed attack because someone's going to be stirred up and going to return. Now, return means again. His sons, we'll read the verse to get the context. His sons shall be stirred up, Seleucus III and Antiochus III. Antiochus is just a young boy. He's only 16 years old at this time, but he is part of it, and he comes to the throne a couple of years later. And shall assemble a multitude of great forces. They're both involved in initial stages of preparation. And now all the tenses, or rather the number of the verbs, change. One is supplied, but it's in the verb shall certainly come, with indignation, by bold, with certainty, with irresistible force. Now one shall come. Two sons had been stirred up and had assembled a great multitude. Now one of them. Why? Because one has been assassinated in the year 223 BC. Will certainly come and overflow and pass through. The metaphor of a river in the springtime overflowing her banks. Overflow and pass through. Now we've dealt with that historically, as well as textually from Daniel 11:10. We know what this means. And you notice we stop short of completing the verse. Then shall he return and be stirred up even to his fortress. Well, let's get into verse 11 so you see kind of what the problem is. And the king of the south shall be moved with choler. So it seems like now our subject is the king of the south. I said that Antiochus III the Great has been semi-successful in his battles. We're going to see in verses 11 and 12 he's not very successful at all when we come to this next great battle in 217. But by the time we get to verse 13 on down through verse 19, we'll see him rather successful. And hence the designation Antiochus, not just the third, but Antiochus the Great. The king of the south, now we're talking about Ptolemy the fourth. The king of the south shall be moved with choler, and shall come forth and fight with him, even with the king of the north. So here's the question. Since Antiochus III attacks and then retreats in the first two-thirds of verse 10, and since in the beginning of verse 11 we see that now it's the king of the south who appears to be on the attack, then would not the end reference to verse 10 also coincide with verse 11 as taking the king of the south, Ptolemy the fourth Philopater, as the subject of these wars? Therefore, once Antiochus has attacked and retreated, now the king of the south, Ptolemy the fourth, is stirred up, and he's mad that someone even tried to head in the general direction of Egypt and attack his kingdom. So then he shall return, that is, go towards Syria, or go at least up into Palestine, and be stirred up even to his fortress. We'd still have to identify his, and would have to identify fortress, or take it as a collective term as we've done earlier, such as up in verse 7. Well, I really don't think that's the case. I think that really the end of the verse does fit with verse 10 as far as the subject is concerned. That is, the personal subject, the individual, the king of the north. But as far as the time period and what battle we're talking about, it really goes with verses 11 and 12. So be sure that you understand that. We're talking about the same man in the end of this verse. We're talking about Antiochus III. But we're not talking about the events of verse 10. Those have taken place a couple of years earlier, namely in 219 BC. Now we're talking about a later time. And so that brings us into the message tonight and brings us into the end of verse 10 plus verses 11 and 12. The Hebrew has two verbs that may well correspond with return and stir up, which are the two words you have in the English text in the end of verse 10. However, in this context, return may better be translated again, where it's used as an auxiliary. So that in the first place, the beginning of verse 10, he was stirred up on one occasion. In the second place, the end of verse 10, he was stirred up again, which I guess a little more graphically helps paint the picture that the one being stirred up, the one initiating everything, is the king of the north and not the king of the south. And that's going to do something for our chart whenever we get back to that in a moment. So if we take return as an auxiliary, then it really means again. In other words, just supply what you have in your margin for this phrase, then shall he return and be stirred up. You'll supply what you have in your margin, although technically and grammatically it's correct what you have in the text, because there are two Hebrew verbs that do correspond to return and to stir up. If it's used in this context as an auxiliary, then it really means again. So our margin reads, then shall he be stirred up again. So now we definitely know, assuming we take this position, which is a position I take, assuming we take this position, we know who the personal subject is. Who's the one getting stirred up? Who's the one who's going to make the advance and take the initiative? It's going to be the king of the north. Therefore, go back to your chart now and notice the reference under the date 217. Ptolemy invades Syria. Well, that's really not exactly how it happens. That kind of comes secondarily. But really you've got the king of the north, as this verse 10 is going to show us. The king of the north, Antiochus III, invades the fortresses, or at least a fortress of Egypt. So you may need either to make the correction there or make the correction in your mind. In 218 BC, to give you this little review history, Nicholas, who was the Egyptian general, marches up to Cilicia and defeats Theodotus, which we discussed in conclusion last week. Perhaps this defeat of now an ally of Antiochus III, Theodotus, is what is the cause that stirs him up again. I mean, why be stirred up? He stirred up the first time just, because his brother has been assassinated, he is king, and now someone has to attack Egypt. But why? He went down there, tried to go down there the first time, is repulsed, goes back because he hears a rumor of a large army gathering. Well, the large army is still there, if not larger as time and as a couple of years have gone by. So why? This is the first thing that came to my mind, when you study this. Why be stirred up again? Something else was what ticked him off, as they say, to stir him up again. Probably it was the battle in 218 that we've already discussed several times before. This apparently is what caused Antiochus to stir himself up and to come against Egypt, which he does in the following year in 217 BC. And he pushes his way through Palestine. He's way past Ptolemais, Tyre, Zidon, Jerusalem, Ashdod. He's all the way down the coast, past Gaza. As a matter of fact, he goes right down to the Egyptian border post that probably is referred to under this phrase, his fortress, the last two words of verse 10, which was a place called Raphia, R-A-P-H-I-A. Thus, the name of this campaign, the Battle of Raphia, was an Egyptian border post. Therefore, the pronoun his probably refers to Ptolemy IV. So thus far, this is what we have. Then shall Antiochus III be stirred up again because of the defeat of his ally Theodotus in Cilicia by the new Egyptian commander-in-chief of the Egyptian forces in Syria, Nicholas, 1 year before, 218 BC. Then because of that, he stirred up, he presses his way. We're not given the words overflow and pass through again, but it's that and then some by this time, because the first time, remember, he's repulsed and he has to go back. But he marches all the way through Palestine. In other words, for this short period of time, just a few months in the year 217 BC, he actually is the one in control. For the first time, the northern kingdom is now in control of Palestine. They'll win it permanently in just a 20 more years or so. But they haven't had it for, well, 103 years. So it's rather significant, although it doesn't last very long. And he comes, Antiochus III, even to his, Ptolemy IV Philopater, his fortress, Raphia, the Egyptian fortification border post known as Raphia. So let me give you a little of the background from what we know, and we do have this in several secular Greek sources of what happened at the Battle of Raphia. First of all, let's look at the divisions that were brought into battle. On the side of Ptolemy, he had the following: 70,000 infantry, and now these aren't large numbers because we've seen battles before, like with Darius against Alexander, of 1,000,000 men. 70,000 infantry, 5,000 cavalry, which is interesting for this period of time. That's a lot of men to be able to provide horses for. 5,000 cavalry and 73 elephants. You'll get familiar with elephants used as warriors because we'll get into that more when we get to the time of Rome and famous people like Hannibal. Then on the side of Antiochus, he puts into battle 62,000 infantry. These numbers are fairly reliable through the secular Greek historians. 6,000 cavalry plus 102 elephants. Now there are two phases to the battle, the initial and the final. Of course, what happens in the initial is never important unless it helps to determine what happens in the final phase, and it doesn't here, but I'll give the initial phase anyway. Antiochus is clearly the winner. 217 BC, in the initial phase of the battle, Antiochus clearly is the winner. But he makes the mistake of allowing his armies to begin to plunder, that is, the dead bodies of their foes, before the victory, the battle, is secure and is complete, which is a mistake that you only make once. This causes Ptolemy and his men to rally. I mean, it kind of eggs you on and encourages you when you're not defeated yet and people are already stripping the bracelets and gold off of, your dead comrades. Then that doesn't go over very well with you. So it gives you what they call the second wind. And you really get ready to fight now. And so the initial phase goes on the side and in the favor of Antiochus. The final phase goes to Ptolemy. He kills 10,000 infantry of Antiochus, 300 cavalry, 5 elephants. It's difficult. They didn't have bazookas back then to bring down an elephant. And he took 4,000 men captive. Now that historically is what happened, and that is what we'll read about in verse 11. I just summed up all of verse 11. We'll go through these verses rather quickly. That's all of verse 11, the Battle of Raphia. Verse 12 is going to give us some of the things that happened after the battle, really a caricature of the new sovereign, Ptolemy IV. So let's read verse 11. The king of the south shall be moved with choler. Why? Well, the king of the north is attacking him. The king of the north is the one who makes the advance. The king of the north is the one who takes the initiative and comes down as far as Raphia. Your chart in saying that the king of the south, Ptolemy, invades Syria is really not totally on the mark. He comes out of Egypt and heads towards Syria, but not until after Syria has begun the march toward Egypt. And they fight at an Egyptian border post and not a Syrian one. He's way down almost to get into Egyptian territory at Raphia. The king of the south shall be moved with choler because of this, and shall come forth and fight with him, who, well, even with the king of the north. And he shall set forth a great multitude. Now the first multitude, there are going to be two multitudes mentioned here in this verse. It's a little confusing. Why it's arranged this way, I don't know, but it's rather obvious who this refers to. The first multitude would obviously refer to the multitude under Ptolemy. because that's really who the subject is going right along. He shall set forth a great multitude. But then the next phrase says, but the multitude shall be given into his hand. Well, that's not his own multitude. That would have to be the 62,000 multitude of the infantry plus cavalry and 102 elephants of Antiochus III. So the first multitude refers to the king of the south, and the second one to the king of the north. We know that because we know who wins the battle. Or to say it another way, we know who loses. The multitude of Antiochus shall be given into the hand of Ptolemy IV. So we can determine that anyway. That's the Battle of Raphia. Verse 12. In verse 12 we have a personal view of the character of Ptolemy IV, which again is borne out by records that are extant. He was a childish, indolent man given to passions and physical excess in all areas of his life. And we're told here that when he has taken away the multitude of the king of the north, that is, his heart would be lifted up. Well, pride. He's lifted up with pride because now he is the sovereign of the nations of the world, of that part of the world. And he shall cast down many 10,000s. Well, he only cast down one 10,000, just 10,000 men. Many 10,000s, it just means myriad, means a lot. You can't take that literally. Just the Hebrew word doesn't have for 10,000s anyway. It just means myriad. It's a lot. We know it to be 10,000. 10,000 men that were actually killed and 4,000 that were taken captive. So 10,000s, it has to be taken symbolically, or you can just change it to a lot of people, or myriads. He shall cast down myriads, but he shall not be strengthened by it. Now here's where we really get into, beyond just the lifted up with pride, we get into this personal, indolent, childish nature and character of Ptolemy IV Philopater. You see, whenever you've won a major battle like that, you have defeated Antiochus III the Great. Now, Antiochus goes on, he's going to come back, as a matter of fact. He'll be back, we'll see him later on in verse 13. So he didn't die in that battle. It's just that he lost all of his men, he lost the war. You lose your empire, you become not the master but the slave of whoever it is who's won the war. Well, that's a prime time to press your claims now. Now that you've won the major battle of that day, the major battle against your foe, your arch enemy, the king of the north, it's time to press your claims. Don't just say, well, that battle's over with, let's go back home. Why not march and take Antioch and take Seleucia and take Tyre and take Ptolemais and take Palestine back? Why not march up there and take everything? That's the time to press your claims. But as I've said, he was an indolent man. He was of childish nature, given to passions of the flesh and excess and lust. He could hardly wait to get back home to Egypt. He was one that was not like his fathers, as I've said before, given to arts, sciences, learning, mathematics, skilled in all of this, a cultured man. He was an overgrown child. That really the only purpose for him being king, as far as he was concerned, was so that he could have everything that he wanted. So he shows himself not to be a very good military leader and not to be a very good political leader at all when you don't press your claims after you've won a major victory. It's just like some politician making some coup with some other politician. Then it's time to really go. You can't just stop and let everything simmer down, because pretty soon the balances will equal back out and you'll be on an equal level again, and you'll have a fair share of everything instead of going ahead and trying to take everything. Now we do have one interesting extra-biblical account that's found in 3rd Maccabees that no doubt is a fabulous account. By fabulous I mean untrue and not reliable, although maybe the essence of the story is true, namely a trip to Jerusalem. But in the 1st chapter of 3rd Maccabees, we're told that Ptolemy IV receives an envoy from Jerusalem at Raphia to congratulate him on his victory. And because of this envoy sent from Jerusalem, which is not that far away from Raphia, then he does decide, before hurriedly and quickly returning to Egypt, well, he hurriedly returns, but he makes one detour. He decides to visit a few cities in Palestine. And, of course, the most important city to visit would be Jerusalem. He's never been there before, but I'm sure he's heard a lot about it. And not only the most important city would be Jerusalem, but the most important thing in Jerusalem to see would be this temple of these people who are unlike any other people in the world because they only worship one God. And they have a temple that's directed towards the worship and the service of what they felt was one supreme being. Now that's unlike anything that Ptolemy was familiar with, because there just weren't other monotheists in the world. So he accepts the congratulations and he decides to make a trip to Jerusalem. He goes into Jerusalem, he marches there with all of his men. He wants to see the temple. Not only that, he wants to have sacrifice offered. He doesn't do it himself, but the professionals in Jerusalem do. He sacrifices at Jerusalem on account of his victory that he's just won. And he gave great gifts to the temple for its service. But he didn't stop with that. He then desired to actually go in the temple itself. Well, according to the account in 3rd Maccabees, of course, the Levites and the priests and the religious professionals, and I don't use that in any derogatory sense, that's what they were, that was their profession, the religious professionals were outraged and incensed over the notion that anyone, especially a Gentile, would presume to even have the thought of going into the temple. And that was a place that obviously was reserved only for a professional class. Only one man could make it all the way into the holiest of all, but others could get around there, and not Gentiles now, but other Jews. They could perform various things in the court, and that's where the great altar was, and so forth. Well, let alone him not being a part of the professional class, he's a Gentile, and they of course can't have him go in there and abominate the place of God with his Gentile pagan presence. So they try their best to prevail upon his conscience with their own religious upbringing. Don't dare go in there. It is a holy place where no one is allowed to go. Well, he goes anyway, and he makes it into the holy place, and that's as far as he makes it. According to the account in 3rd Maccabees 1, he attempts to go into the holiest of all. Now, he's been told by the Jews before that obviously is the place that anyone would want to go if you're going to snoop into the presence of God. Getting just into the holy place, well, others have made it in there. But the holiest of all, and on a regular basis, you've got to go in there once a week just for the bread on the shoe table. But into the holiest of all, that's once a year. So over the centuries, that's not very often. Once a year, and only one man. And only just a handful of men over the centuries have been high priests and have been able to go in there. Well, of course, according to Jewish story, they wouldn't, because they wouldn't think that God would allow him to make it all the way into the holy place, the holiest of all. He makes it into the holy place, but not the Holy of Holies. So according to chapter 1, verses 9 to 11 and verse 24, 3rd Maccabees 1, 9 to 11 and verse 24, he flees in horror after seeing some apparition and being stricken with paralysis and or leprosy. We don't know how much of that is true. I said before, maybe the essence, maybe the germ of the account is true, but it obviously is a fabulous, fictitious account. That sounds good. It fits right in a book like 3rd Maccabees, and sounds good to the Jews, and God's going to take care of his holy place. The reason why it's probably not true is because God did allow Gentiles to make it all the way in, and that happens later on. So he wasn't protecting that, in some peculiar sense all the time as far as Israel was concerned between the Testaments, or even before the Testament. Well, even before there was a temple. He allowed them to take the ark, the Philistines, and play with the ark and look in the ark. And of course some of them were stricken dead, but many people had seen the ark, had been passed all throughout the land of the Philistines. Well, my point is, other people, other Gentiles did make it in, and nothing happened to them. I'm not saying that God's not watching over Israel during this period, because no doubt he is. As a matter of fact, that's something we'll be able to bring out later on. I forgot whatever the other passage was I was thinking of yesterday, but I know of one here in Daniel 11 that's rather remarkable, on how God did watch after Israel during that period. Even when the prophets had been taken away, the ministry of prophetism was no longer valid, visions and dreams had passed away, the canon of Scripture had been closed, and for all practical purposes we have a period of 400 silent years because God is silent. So it's interesting when you compare that with the history of the church, that even when you get in times like that, God providentially is still in control, and God providentially still has somebody somewhere. And it's true with the intertestamental period, and I find that very, very interesting. And you have to kind of use that for biblical text if you want to come to some other notions about the church, as I was discussing with some people not long ago. Well, when he makes it back to Egypt, he ends up in Egypt with a very anti-Jewish attitude. I wonder why. Well, he's leprous. According to the account, he's leprous and or he suffered paralysis, and he wasn't very excited on being scared out of his wits by this apparition in the temple. Evidently, something took place because, according to history, he did end up in Egypt with a very anti-Jewish attitude. So, I mean, you have to trace that back to some calls that came before. What happened? We don't know. Maybe the Jewish priests and Levites weren't so condescending to him whenever he came there, like, get out of here, you pagan. You're not even you can't offer sacrifice on our altar. That would have been enough to send him home pouting, knowing the character of Ptolemy IV. So whenever he does get down to Egypt with this very anti-Jewish attitude, obviously his subjects, the other Egyptians, pick this up, and there begins a small but intense period of persecution of the Jews in Egypt, particularly in Alexandria. So you might want to note that for the year 217, a period of persecution. We have to piece all of these things together as we go along to know what's going on with Israel during the period between the Testaments, because we have so little information. Now a word or two about Antiochus the Great before moving on. He ruled Palestine for only a very short period of time in 217. He's going to end up ruling it permanently later on in just 20 years. But while he was in control for this short period of time, he was very well liked among the Jews. He gave them totally free exercise of their religion, some of which had been quenched by the Ptolemies. What parts we don't know. He made them exempt from taxation, and he passed laws that the traders and merchants that came to sell and to buy and to trade in Jerusalem had to abide by the kosher dietary strictures of the Jews in Jerusalem. Liberties were being taken that were putting the Jews in compromising positions and, well, just making life miserable and rather difficult for them. So three things are accomplished: the free exercise of religion, exemption from taxation, and he passes laws where traders and merchants have to abide by the Jewish kosher dietary strictures that have been passed down in the laws of Moses. Now, the next verse in Daniel is going to be dealing with Antiochus the Great again, but it's going to be dealing with him 15 years later. So we have to fill in the information in this 15 years for you tonight. What is going on with Antiochus the Great in this 15-year period from 217 to 202, which is when we will see him again. 203, 202, we will see him again. Well, not a lot is going on. A whole lot more is going to happen beginning in 202. Then we'll just have a lot of information about Antiochus the Great, because then for the first time we're going to bring the Romans into our study, because they're brought into the affairs of Antiochus. But here's chiefly what happens from the years 212 to 204. The years 212 to 204, Antiochus, still alive, defeated grievously at the Battle of Raphia, but still alive and kicking, concentrates his attention on his eastern front. Now, he has Egypt in mind all along, and he's going to come back to Egypt, as we'll see, beginning in verse 13. But he concentrates all of his attention on the eastern front. In 209, he defeats the Parthians. We're familiar with their territory. We've seen it before. and carries away the temple treasure of the chief goddess of Ecbatana, which was one of the ancient capitals of Persia, as well as of the Parthians. This is in 209. Then in 208, he defeats the Bactrians, another group of people in the same Mesopotamian region as the Parthians, the Bactrians. And it is from these two conquests that he gained the title the Great. He pushes past the realm of the Bactrians and the Parthians and extends his eastern border all the way to the western border of India. So he is in total control of what used to be the ancient Babylonian, Assyrian, Medo-Persian Empire, and as far north as the Caspian Sea. And he is mentioned by name in 1 Maccabees 1:10. Okay, so much for the Battle of Raphia. We should all be complete on that. That takes care of the last of the two-thirds of verse 10 and verses 11 and 12. Now, let's see what's going on as far as the high priest is concerned. We've talked about the high priesthood from Onias I, I think all the way down to the time of Onias II, which has covered, Onias II inclusive, which has covered 5 of the Jewish high priests. Now, Onias II has a son, Simon II, of Simon I. Now, at the time we have left, we're going to do a little discussion here of a very interesting question that concerns the Simons, Simon I and Simon II. I put it in tonight because I knew we'd be completed with these verses, and we don't have enough time to start into verses 13 and 14, so it's a good time, although maybe it's a little premature. Let me see what I can say. You might want to take note of this just for completeness' sake. We will come back to it later because it's a very confusing account because it's found in Josephus. If something's found in Josephus, sometimes it's a little confusing. We have 2 important families that arise in Jerusalem, known as the house of the Oniads and the house of the Tobiads. And you see the names there on your chart. The house of the Oniads and the house of the Tobiads that vie for the control of the high priesthood. There's a man whose name is Joseph that's discussed in quite a lot of detail in Josephus. And he's mentioned on your chart, and there's no doubt about the fact he's a true historical figure. We will cover him later. Just trace Joseph down, and you see we're talking about around 202. You could go up or down, but 202 BC, which brings us into this next period, verse 13 of Antiochus III the Great. So we really can't get that far. Let me see if I can remember. I don't have all that before me because that's another night's worth of notes, but let me see if I can remember. Joseph, what's confusing is that Josephus, and he's the one who gives us the account, has Ptolemy Ergetes coming after the time of Antiochus III the Great, and he is married to Cleopatra. And all of this is happening during the time of Joseph. Well, if you look on your chart, those 4 figures are scattered out. Ptolemy III, Antiochus III, Joseph, and our first Cleopatra done in 193 BC. That's what makes that difficult. We're going to come back to that again, but it has to do with the period of Onias II, which it is true that legitimately Onias II takes us back to Ptolemy III, but it doesn't correspond on our chart anyway to the time of Antiochus III, Cleopatra, or to Joseph. Joseph is the chief figure in this whole account that I'm talking about now, and he's from the house of the Tobiads, because his mother was related to the high priest, Onias II. According to our chart, that is placed down in the period of Simon II, which I don't know. I guess I agree with. They don't have any question marks here. I don't have any question marks. It's just that it's hard to prove one way or the other. But it probably is a little early to be dealing with that, for that to be taking place all the way back during the time of Onias the Second. Well, be that as it may, that really is not my topic now. Our topic concerns Simon the First and Simon the Second. We're going to be talking about two questions that are dovetailing with one another. You'll have to keep them separate. Who is Simon the Just? Number two, who is the Simon of Ecclesiasticus chapter 50? Very interesting questions. If you have your Apocrypha, please open to Ecclesiasticus chapter 50. If you don't and you're sitting near someone who does, then why don't you look along. We're going to read, a large section of this chapter. Okay, are we all ready to get into this? It gets a little confusing. You write what you think is important, and I'll tell you definitely what's important when we get there. Ecclesiasticus chapters 44 through 49 are the major section of the book that are in praise of famous men from Enoch to Nehemiah. Then in chapter 50, one post-biblical figure is added and given more space than any of the biblical figures from Enoch down to the time of Nehemiah, which is significant without saying anything else. All of these great men of the Old Testament, Abraham and David, and all the way down to the time of Nehemiah. And they're given various amounts of space, depending on, I guess, the discretion of the author. But when we get to chapter 50, the in praise of famous men of biblical figures from 44 through 49 is now concluded. We get to chapter 50, we're still in praise of famous men, but now we're talking about someone that's post-biblical, someone that comes after the time of the close of the Old Testament period, after the close of the canon, after the time of Nehemiah, and his name is Simon. Now, they didn't always, call themselves, I'm Simon the 914th or something. It's just, I'm Simon. I'm the next one, whatever the last one was, and I'm the next number after that. So, in other words, we don't find in this chapter which Simon is this. Simon the first, second, third, fourth, fifth, just Simon. Now, we are told that he's Simon the son of Onias. Well, we've got more than one Onias. And it just so happens we have two Simons who both had different fathers, who both had the name Onias. So just telling us we're talking about Simon, son of Onias, doesn't tell us anything, except it's not Simon, son of Nebuchadnezzar, but it's Simon, son of Onias. Now, we've given you before in covering Ecclesiasticus a little bit of the chronology, which I think we need to give again to study this. Back in the prologue, we have a mentioning of one King Ergetes, which helps us date the book. Now, it could not be the first Ergetes, Ptolemy the third, because he did not rule at least 38 years. I'm just giving you this because we've given it to you before, but he only ruled 24. That's according to the third paragraph of the prologue, written in 132 by the grandson of the author of the book. It had to be the second Ptolemy, Ptolemy the seventh, who ruled 54 years. So we know the prologue dates from 132 BC. But since chapter 50 and verse 1 was written by the grandfather of the author of the prologue, then it has to date around 170. So this man who's writing the book lives in 170 BC. Now you say, well, that's way past our date where we're talking about right now. That's right. But he's written about things, some of which have come before him, some of which maybe are coming during the period that we're talking about right now. And just because he's living in 170 doesn't mean he was born in 170. He must be an older man by now. He had to have been living way back before 200 BC. Let's make him 50 years old. So we've got him back to 220 BC at least. Remember, he's an educated man traveled widely read, a scholar of scholars, the writer of Ecclesiasticus. He has to be at least 50, maybe 60. That puts him back to 230 BC, which in other words puts him way back in the time period of at least one of these men by the name of Simon. He's referring back to some earlier Simon, that is earlier from 170 when the book is being written, who is the son of Onias. But as I've said, there are two of these, two Simons, two men by the name of Onias. So which one is he talking about? And what's the big deal about it anyway? Well, there is a big deal about it, as we'll see whenever we get into this. So we're going to be dealing with these two questions side by side. Who is Simon the Just? And who is the Simon of Ecclesiasticus? In other words, are they the same person? Now let me tell you now that you won't find any agreement because we don't have just very definite, precise facts to help us determine the ID of the identification, the ID of these two men, or this one individual if it's one man. So you're not going to find any agreement in what you read, and you can see points both ways. I guess I'm more concerned with the second of the question than the first, and I think it's going to be a little easier and maybe a little more definitive in giving our answer to the second of the questions than it will be to the first. Josephus in Antiquities, Book 12, Chapter 2, Paragraph 5, refers to some Jewish high priest by the name of Simon the Just. And this is our reference. Simon the Just, Book 12, Chapter 2, Paragraph 5. He said he was called this for two reasons. Number one, his piety towards God, and number two, his kindness toward his fellow Israelites. Which Simon is he? Scholars are equally divided. Is it Simon the first or Simon the second? Well, some points to consider. The description as the just, that's a fairly good title. One of the apostles became known later, the first century, as James the Just. And we have an analogy of that before, Simon the Just. The reasons speak highly of him, his piety towards God and his kindness towards fellow Jews. It's been suggested that the Just, this title, better fits the first of the two Simons, since we know a little more about him. I guess we know a little more about him depending on which Simon we have in Ecclesiasticus 50. A lot depends. These questions, that's why I said they dovetail, they're interrelated. To answer one kind of answers the other, depending on which one you answer first. And if you answer the other one, well, it might not help you with the opposite question. Not only do we perhaps know a little more about him, but perhaps what we do know about him speaks a little more highly of his character. Now, if that would be true of Simon the second, then it's possible that Ecclesiasticus 50 could bear this out, as we see particularly in verses 5 through 21. Or it could refer to the first Simon, since we do have a little information about him, and he was a very good, upright man. He was good and upright because he's right in the line of the high priest that came, he's closer to the ones that we know to be good ones, like the ones in Nehemiah chapter 12, the ones during the time of Nehemiah's governorship of Palestine and Israel. Getting back to Ecclesiasticus chapter 50, the description of this man's work, verses 1 to 4, could fit the time of Ptolemy the First. You have to see all of this on your chart here. Could fit the time of Ptolemy the First. Because we know in Book 12, chapter 1, that he captured Jerusalem on a Sabbath day and he took 100,000 Jews captive. You get all this down, and then we'll read the verse, and you'll see what I'm talking about. I mean, this is very interesting. I'm sure other people know about it. There's no doubt about that, but lay people certainly don't. It's very interesting what we're going to read here. Book 12, chapter 1, we know that Ptolemy I captured Jerusalem on a Sabbath day, and he takes 100,000 Jews captive. In the process, he no doubt partially wrecked the temple and the city. You don't just, take captives with no battle or no destruction of property. So if we're granted those assumptions, and you have to be granted those assumptions because we're not told everything in Josephus exactly what happened to the temple and what happened to the walls of the city. If we knew that, we could compare that with these first 4 verses. But if that's granted to us, then we could say possibly that could fit during the time of Ptolemy I. Why? Well, look with me at these first few verses. It was the high priest Simon, son of Onias, in whose lifetime the house was repaired. Now, Simon, son of Onias, it has to be Simon the first or the second. And you can look on your chart and find our dates here, 280 down to the time we're talking about right now for Simon the second. The house, that is the temple, the house of the Lord, was repaired, in whose days the temple was fortified. He laid the foundation for the high double wall, the high retaining wall of the temple precinct. Some type of walls that are being built here. So he was involved in architecture with regard to the city and the temple. In his day, they dug a reservoir, probably to hold water in case of a siege of the city or something. A cistern as broad as the sea. He applied his mind to protecting his people from ruin and strengthened the city against siege. Now, there's no doubt about the fact this is a true account here. Remember, whenever we're studying the Apocrypha, and we're not told somewhere outside of it that what they're giving us is false historical material, well, we take for granted that it's true. There's no reason for them to be lying about this. This doesn't make any difference one way or the other. It's not some religious teaching he's giving here. Now, what's interesting is this little phrase here in verse 4, he applied his mind to protecting the people from ruin. One of the 2 reasons for Simon being called Simon the Just was because of his kindness towards the people. And this is kindness. You're trying to protect your own people from ruin. Then that would, at least on the surface, what we've seen thus far seem to imply that Simon the Just would be the same as the Simon of Ecclesiastes chapter 50. Are you following what I'm saying here? Now, that's just on the surface. That's not necessarily true. So we said it could be the Simon that we're talking about now, the first, and that would fit back during the time of Ptolemy I. However, it could also refer, these 4 verses, this very detailed work in this description, verses 1 to 4, it could be Simon II, which would put him during the time of Antiochus III, because during the time of Antiochus III, he decided to repair the city as a reward for good conduct the Jewish people showed toward him when he came to the throne and took over Palestine. Which, as we have seen from tonight, we know to be true that Antiochus III did have a good working relationship with the people. He made them exempt from taxes, freedom of worship, freedom of religion, and the business about kosher dietary strictures passed down from the law. So that's another point now in the favor of this being Simon II. It had to be the second if we're talking about something happening during the period of Antiochus III the Great. Something else, the Talmud tells us that Simon I was the high priest that met Alexander the Great and not Jaddua. Josephus tells us that it was Jaddua and not Simon I, because you have to just go back, 2 generations, Jaddua, then Onias I, and Simon I, as being the one who greeted Alexander the Great, but the Talmud is notorious for being chronologically mistaken, so probably Josephus is right, if anyone is right. Where do we go from here? The only remote problem, and I guess it's a little more than remote, in identifying the Simon of Ecclesiasticus chapter 50, which is primarily what we're concerned about, with Simon the first. It's going to be seen as we read beginning with verse 5. Now, if you can remember all of these details in this history that I've given you and think logically and reduce things down to answers, then maybe you'll come up with the answer as we read here beginning with verse 5. How do we know it's not Simon the first? A lot of people, it seems to be most people, believe that it's Simon the first. I doubt it really does anything to your salvation which one you believe, but it's interesting. How glorious he was, surrounded by the people, when he came from behind the temple curtain. He was like the morning star appearing through the clouds, or the moon at the full, like the sun shining on the temple of the Most High, or the light of the rainbow on the gleaming clouds, like a rose in spring. This is a description of Simon, son of Onias. Or lilies like a fountain of water, like a green shoot upon Lebanon on a summer's day, or burning incense in the censer, like a cup of beaten gold decorated with every kind of precious stone, like an olive tree laden with fruit, or a cypress with its top in the clouds. When he put on his gorgeous vestments, robed himself in perfect splendor, and went up to the holy altar, he added luster to the court of the sanctuary. When the priests were handing him the portions of the sacrifice, as he stood by the altar hearth with his brothers round about him like a garland, he was like a young cedar of Lebanon. In the midst of a circle of palms, all the sons of Aaron, in their magnificence, stood with the Lord's offering in their hands before the whole congregation of Israel. To complete the ceremonies at the altar and adorn the offering of the Most High, the Almighty, he held out his hand for the libation cup. He poured out the blood of the grape, poured its fragrance at the foot of the altar to the Most High, the King of all. Then the sons of Aaron shouted and blew their trumpets of beaten silver. They sounded a mighty fanfare as a reminder before the Lord. Instantly the people as one man fell on their faces to worship the Lord their God, the Almighty, the Most High. Then the choir broke into praise in the full, sweet strains of resounding song, while the people of the Most High were making their petitions to the merciful Lord. Hey, sacrifice, time of prayer, you see, they go together. Until the liturgy of the Lord was finished and the ritual complete. Then Simon came down, raised his hands over the whole congregation of Israel to pronounce the Lord's blessing. Proud to take his name on his lips, and a second time they bowed in worship to receive blessing from the Most High. Now there's no doubt about the fact this is a true account of what took place at a Jewish ceremony between the Testaments. And that is what makes Ecclesiasticus chapter 50 so very, very significant. We know what happens as far as the ritual and liturgy is concerned in biblical periods because we have that recorded in the Old Testament. But if you're like me, and you're putting all these things together about Jewish history and apostasy, and Christian history and apostasy, then you're wondering about, well, what happened after the Jews fell away? What happened after God took his prophets out of their midst? What happened after the Bible was completed? What happened after, as the Talmud said, the Holy Spirit departed from Israel, after the writings of Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi? Remember the reference from the Talmud that the Holy Spirit left Israel after Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. And what happened during Israel? Did Israel just fall back into just utter apostasy and rebellion against God? Not according to Ecclesiasticus 50. And there's no reason to believe this is not true. It is true. Tremendous ceremony that, if you read all these details here, is in accords with the liturgy and ritual prescribed in Old Testament law. Well, you're not shouting, but you're not supposed to, I don't guess, but I'm really blessed. It's very interesting. I want to know, you see, what's going on during that period. And you don't have any sources to determine what's going on. As a matter of fact, this kind of helps you understand some of the things you'll read in the Old Testament. It has it step by step here listed, what happens and how he receives offerings from other priests and Levites and blesses the people with the Aaronic blessing of Numbers chapter 6. The Lord bless thee and keep thee and make his face to shine upon thee. That was a high priest blessing. That's what he's giving here in these verses that we're reading. Very interesting, very detailed picture, which I guess is our point in reading this, not only to supply us with sacrificial liturgical information of what's going on, but to help us identify which Simon it is. Now let me say this. If we have to know this material for one point or the other, it'd be best to know it for the information that it supplies concerning sacrifice and ritual. Ritual not because we can find out which Simon we're talking about. So let that be understood now. That's primarily where our concern should lie. That primarily is where mine lies, that I can find out what is going on as far as liturgy and ritual is concerned in Judaism during this period. But getting back to what our topic is tonight, we're still in politics here, the political part of the intertestamental period. What about which Simon? You have any guess? How can we tell from this? We're talking about Simon the first or Simon the second. Anyone have a guess? And tell me why. We only have one reason why. It probably is Simon the second. Why? Because this account, doesn't it to you, reads like an eyewitness account. This man has seen this happen here. And he did not live during the time of Simon the first. That was 100 years before him. So it's my guess, this is what I'm putting forward to you tonight, it's my guess, that's why I took the time to read all of that. This, because it reads like an eyewitness account, he describes his majesty. He's like a cedar on Lebanon. Well, how do you know if you've never seen the man? He died 100 years before you were born. How do you know then? How do you know at the ceremony? How can you really describe in full detail exactly what happened and how all the people, with this glory going on around the sacrifice, fell on their faces and praised God? Unless you had actually seen it yourself. Notice verse 5, how glorious he was, surrounded by the people when he came from behind the temple curtain. They saw the high priest after he had been behind the curtain. And you know what this is talking about? We're talking about Day of Atonement here. I mean, this is one of the crucial passages of literature you have to be familiar with if you're going to be knowledgeable in Old Testament law and sacrifice. Because you're given a very detailed account here of what happens. And we know we're talking not just about an ordinary day here. You all following along? You only go behind the curtain of the temple once a year. And that's on the great Day of Atonement, Leviticus chapter 16. So we know this is a Day of Atonement ceremony. And this man had seen this ceremony, had never forgotten it. He says that the high priest was glorious whenever he came out. Like somehow God's presence was with him. Even though we're talking about after the biblical period. Somehow God's presence was with him. Then he goes on in all of these metaphors, morning star, clouds, moon, sun, rainbow, rose, fountains of water, green shoots, incense, gold, precious stones, olive trees, cypress, on and on and on, metaphors describing what he looked like. Now, let's see what our dates are here for Simon. Notice your dates there. If we're going to put this man writing this around 170, Simon, let's say he's ruling as high priest down to around 200 or 195 or something like that, then this man who's writing Ecclesiasticus evidently beheld this whenever he was a young man. 20s, 30s, something like that. He actually beheld this ceremony. And it made evidently such an impact upon him that in concluding biblical figures from Enoch to Nehemiah, he sticks in this one high priest because it had such a remarkable impression on him. That the ceremony on the Day of Atonement was so fantastic that as a young lad, as a young man, he had never forgotten what he had seen before. Never forgotten the glory of the high priest. Remember, on the Day of Atonement, he had special garbs that he was clothed in. Rather plain, really not that elaborate, rather plain, because no one was holy before God on that day. God was the only holy one in Israel, and you were trying to get holy by having these sacrifices offered. So if you'll grant me all of these presuppositions that I burdened you with tonight, then we'll conclude that the Simon of Ecclesiasticus is Simon the Second. Now, one minor problem with that would be that in Josephus, he does have one derogatory statement about Simon the Second, that he was a thief. Well, how do we reconcile that? Well, you can steal and nobody can know about it, except maybe, a couple of people, and then Josephus finds out about it through some writings later on. That wouldn't necessarily hurt the presence of his majesty, so to speak, whenever he comes out from the temple on this great Day of Atonement. The description, to me anyway, just seems too full, too vivid, too complete not to be an eyewitness account. And if that's true, it could in no sense of the word refer to Simon the First. Back to our first question, who is Simon the Just? Because the references that we have to Simon the First are only good, and those to Simon the Second, sometimes good, sometimes not good, then again, it's only hypothesis that I don't know whether or not it can be proven yet one way or the other, but Simon the Just would be a reference to Simon the First. So we're talking about two questions because we're talking about two men that easily are confused in various ways. Sometimes Simon the First is made out to be both the just and the man of chapter 50. Sometimes it's Simon the Second made out to be both. Sometimes Simon the Second is Simon the Just, and Simon the First is the Simon of Ecclesiasticus 50. And I guess those are about the three options that you'd have, besides what maybe is the better of those options, a fourth option that would keep them distinct but would transfer the role of Simon the First being Simon the Just, and Simon the Second being the Simon of Ecclesiasticus chapter 50. One more comment about Simon the First and we'll be through. He served very well in the liturgical role of the high priest. He was a great role model and community leader before the people. He was a very famous teacher. The high priests then were teachers and not just men involved in liturgy. And according to the Talmud, he's remembered for his most famous dictum, which is the following, and I quote, "The world rests upon three things, the law, love, and kindness." The law, love, and kindness. The world rests upon three things. Recorded of Simon the Just in the Talmud. Okay, that's all we're going to deal with there tonight. You may, whenever you have extra time, want to look over that 50th chapter again. It's very, very interesting.